Hi, beautiful listeners. Times are scary lately. We have to stand together. I hope we will all be safe and okay. Thank you for listening to this story. Thank you for subscribing. We appreciate you so much. Now on to the story. We often look at the world around us. We see the grand tapestry of human existence. It's filled with conflict and with harmony, with love and with loss. We're taught that history is a story of nations rising and falling. It's a tale of ideologies clashing in the great theatre of life. But what if the story we've been told isn't the whole truth? What if the wars that scar our history books, the conflicts that define our present, aren't the result of inevitable human nature? What if they're, instead, the result of a deliberate, calculated design? A plan conceived not on the battlefield, but in quiet rooms, far from the public eye. A plan that serves an agenda we were never meant to understand. Imagine a world teetering on the brink. Tensions are high. The news speaks of nothing but impending doom. Nations point fingers at one another. Leaders deliver speeches filled with fire and fury, calling their people to arms. It feels real, it feels necessary. We're led to believe that our way of life is under threat, that our freedom must be defended with the ultimate sacrifice. But look closer. Look beyond the flags and the anthems. You might begin to see the strings. You might begin to question who is truly pulling them. Is this our war? Or are we merely pawns in a much larger, much more sinister game? A game whose rules we do not know and whose prize we will never share. This is the story of such a time. A time, not so different from our own, when the drums of war beat with a terrifying rhythm. The year is 2025. The world holds its breath, waiting for the first shot to be fired in what everyone is calling the Third World War. The reasons given are many. Economic collapse, resource scarcity, ancient hatreds reignited. They sound plausible. They sound like the very reasons we've always gone to war. But beneath this surface of chaos, a different story unfolds. It's a story of a secret agenda, a horrifying plan to reshape humanity by force, not for the good of the many, but for the power of a select few. What if the ultimate conflict wasn't between countries, but between the powerful and the powerless? What if the goal was not victory for one nation over another, but a drastic, chilling reduction of the human population itself? This is the unsettling possibility we must explore. A world where war is not a tragic failure of diplomacy, but a horrifying success of a hidden plan. A plan to cull the herd, to solve a perceived problem of overpopulation with the cruelest tool imaginable. We must ask ourselves the difficult questions. Who would benefit from such a catastrophe? And how could such a monstrous idea ever be put into motion? The answers may shake the very foundations of what we believe about our world and those who lead it. Before the drums of war grew so loud, there was another global event. It was an event that touched every single person on the planet. A global health crisis swept across the land, and with it came a proposed solution. A mandatory vaccination program was rolled out with unprecedented speed and authority. We were told it was for our own good. It was presented as the only way to protect ourselves, our families, and our communities. The message was clear and constant. Trust the science, follow the mandate, and we will return to normal. It was a time of great fear, but also a time of great hope that this would be our salvation. However, the architects of the grand plan had a different objective in mind. The vaccines in this dark scenario were not merely a public health measure. They were a test of compliance, a test of control. They were filled with poisons, and as Bill said, he wants to get rid of 50% of the population by end 2025. They did it through poison. The hidden agenda was not to heal, but to see how easily the world's population could be guided by fear. They wanted to see if they could implement a global directive and have the vast majority of people follow it without question. For their ultimate goal of population reduction, they needed a method that was efficient and subtle. The vaccine program was their first, quiet attempt. It was a grand experiment in mass obedience, but humanity is not so easily herded. People began to ask questions. They researched. They talked to one another. Despite the immense pressure from governments and media, a significant number of people resisted. They valued their bodily autonomy. They were skeptical of a solution that was forced upon them. The resistance was not uniform, but it was widespread. It was enough to disrupt the plan. The numbers did not fall as the architects had intended. The program did not achieve its secret, sinister goal. The mandatory vaccines, as a tool for their agenda, had failed. They had underestimated the strength of the human spirit and our innate desire for freedom. This failure was a critical turning point for the secret cabal. Their quiet clinical approach had not worked. The resistance it generated showed them that a more drastic, more chaotic method was needed. They realized that to achieve their goal of halving the world's population by their 2025 deadline, they could not rely on subtle coercion. They needed a bigger, more terrifying distraction. They needed an event so overwhelming that people would not have the time or the energy to question it. They needed a crisis that would pit neighbor against neighbor, country against country. They needed a war. The failure of the vaccine gambit directly led to the decision to ignite the flames of World War III. The decision was made in the silent, opulent chambers of power. The world would burn. The motive was as simple as it was monstrous control. In their view, the planet was overpopulated. Resources were becoming scarce. Humanity, they believed, was a virus threatening the health of the Earth, and more importantly, threatening their own privileged existence. They saw themselves not as villains, but as reluctant saviors. They were the surgeons willing to perform a painful operation to save the patient. They convinced themselves that a culling was necessary, a great reset that would wash away the excess and leave behind a more manageable, more compliant world for them to rule. To achieve this, they weaponized fear. Fear is the most powerful tool for controlling large populations. It short-circuits our ability to think critically. It makes us look for a strong leader to protect us. The media, under their influence, became a perpetual engine of terror. Every news broadcast, every headline, every social media feed was carefully curated to stoke division and anxiety. They painted pictures of foreign enemies, of imminent threats lurking just over the horizon. They turned cultural differences into existential dangers. They made us afraid of our neighbors, of people who looked different, spoke a different language, or prayed to a different god. Living under this plan was like living with a constant, low hum of dread. The air itself felt heavy with suspicion. Friends eyed each other with distrust. Old alliances between nations crumbled, replaced by accusations and threats. Propaganda was everywhere, seeping into our homes through our screens, poisoning conversations and relationships. The world was intentionally polarized into stark, opposing camps. You were either with us, or you were with the terrorists. There was no middle ground, no room for nuance or understanding. This atmosphere of perpetual crisis was designed to break our spirits, to make us desperate for any solution, even a violent one. The goal was to make us beg for war. They wanted us to see it as a necessary evil, a bitter pill we must swallow to survive. They manufactured incidents like 9/11, staged provocations, and fanned the flames of nationalism until the world was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. The emotional and psychological toll was immense. People felt helpless, caught in a current pulling them toward a catastrophe they did not want, but felt powerless to stop. The architects of this plan were counting on this sense of helplessness. They believed that a frightened, divided, and exhausted humanity would march willingly into the slaughter they had so carefully prepared. In the deepest shadows of this global conspiracy, light begins to find a way in. It does not come from a grand announcement or a heroic whistleblower on the evening news. It starts much smaller. It begins as a whisper. A quiet conversation between two data analysts in a government agency who notice anomalies that do not fit the official story. They see economic models that predict war with an unnatural certainty. They see resource allocations that make no sense for a nation preparing for a traditional conflict. These small inconsistencies are like cracks in a great dam, tiny at first, but holding back a flood of truth. These whispers travel. A journalist, disillusioned with the state-sponsored narrative, receives an encrypted message from an anonymous source. The message contains a fragment of a document, a partial transcript of a secret meeting. It speaks not of national defense but of population targets. It uses cold, corporate language to discuss the scheduled reduction of human life. The journalist, at great personal risk, begins to investigate. They connect with other truth seekers, a low-level military officer, a university professor, a retired diplomat. Each holds a small piece of the puzzle. Alone, their information is meaningless. Together, it begins to form a terrifying picture. The truth spreads not through the mainstream channels, which are tightly controlled, but through the decentralized networks of the people. It moves through encrypted chat groups, independent forums, and old-fashioned word of mouth. It is a grassroots awakening. Hacktivists work tirelessly to bypass government firewalls, leaking classified documents onto the open web. Citizen journalists piece together the evidence, creating timelines and connecting the dots for everyone to see. The official story of us versus them begins to crumble as a new, more horrifying narrative emerges, a story of a few powerful individuals against all of humanity. This process is slow and dangerous. Those who seek the truth are branded as traitors, as conspiracy theorists, as enemies of the state. They are hunted, silenced, and discredited. But the idea, once planted, is impossible to kill. The more the authorities try to suppress the information, the more people become convinced that it must be true. The very act of censorship becomes a confirmation of the lie. People start to look at the world with new eyes. They begin to question the fear they have been fed. They see the supposed enemy on their screens and realize they are just people, like them, being fed the same lies. The grand deception begins to unravel. What happens when an entire planet decides not to fight? Well, the day after the revelation, something extraordinary occurred. It began with the soldiers. On a dozen different fronts, in trenches and on naval ships, soldiers on opposing sides simply put down their weapons. They had seen the truth. They understood that the person they were ordered to kill was not their enemy. Their true enemy was the group of leaders who had sent them there to die for a lie. A soldier in one army raised a white flag. A soldier on the other side walked out unarmed to meet him. They did not speak the same language, but they understood each other perfectly. This act of defiance spread like wildfire. News of the peaceful stand-downs, shared on newly liberated communication channels, inspired others. Factory workers who were producing ammunition and military hardware walked off the job. They laid down their tools and declared they would no longer build the instruments of their own destruction. Truck drivers refused to transport tanks and supplies to the front lines. They parked their rigs across major highways, creating peaceful blockades. The entire logistical chain of war, the vast and complex machine that feeds on conflict, ground to a halt. It was a global general strike against war itself. Citizens poured into the streets of every major capital city, but these were not protests born of anger. They were demonstrations of peace. Millions of people, from all walks of life, gathered in public squares, not to riot, but to sit in silence. They held signs with one simple message: "We will not fight." They linked arms, creating human chains that stretched for miles, surrounding government buildings and military headquarters. It was a quiet, powerful, and undeniable statement. The people were taking back their power, not with violence, but with a collective refusal to cooperate with the agents of violence. The leaders, the architects of the war, were left powerless. An army that will not fight is no longer an army. A plan for war is meaningless if no one is willing to wage it. They had relied on their ability to divide and conquer, but now humanity was united against them. They issued threats and orders, but they were ignored. Their authority, which was built on a foundation of lies and fear, had evaporated. They were like kings with no subjects, generals with no soldiers. The Great Refusal showed the world a profound truth. The power of rulers is granted to them by the consent of the governed. And on that day, humanity withdrew its consent. The unity that emerged was a beautiful and unexpected thing. It transcended all the lines that had been drawn to keep people apart. Old and young marched side by side. The wealthy businessman stood with the struggling farmer. People of different faiths, who had been told they were mortal enemies, now shared food and water at the peaceful demonstrations. The labels of nationality, race, and religion seemed to fade away, revealing the simple, underlying truth of a shared humanity. They were no longer Americans, Russians, or Chinese. They were simply people, united in a common cause: the preservation of life and peace. This unity was not just passive, it was active and creative. Artists who once painted propaganda posters now painted murals of peace on the very walls where calls to war had been displayed. Musicians who had composed nationalistic anthems now gathered in public squares for impromptu concerts, their melodies weaving a new song of global harmony. Children who had been taught to fear the children of other nations now connected online, sharing messages of friendship and hope. They were building bridges where their parents had been told to build walls. This explosion of creativity was a testament to the human spirit's desire to build rather than destroy. Communities began to organize themselves. They created local councils to ensure that everyone had food and water during the global strike. They set up communication networks to share information and coordinate their peaceful actions. People who had been strangers just weeks before were now working together like a family. They were proving that humanity did not need the old structures of power, which had led them to the brink of annihilation. They could rely on each other. This grassroots movement was a living demonstration of a new kind of society, one based on cooperation and mutual respect, rather than competition and fear. The most moving displays of unity happened at the borders. These artificial lines on a map had been designated as the front lines of the coming war. Now they became meeting places. People from opposing nations gathered on either side of the fences and barricades. They shared stories. They showed each other pictures of their families. They recognized their shared hopes and dreams for their children. In a powerful symbolic gesture, people began to dismantle the barriers with their bare hands, not as an act of invasion, but as an act of invitation. They were erasing the lines that had been used to divide them, declaring with one voice that they were one human family. With the machinery of war silenced and the world united, the people turned their collective attention to the now isolated leaders. The demand was clear and universal. It was not a call for revenge or punishment. It was a demand for a fundamental change in how the world was governed. The people insisted on transparency. No more secret meetings, no more hidden agendas. All decisions that affected the lives of the global population would have to be made in the open, with the full knowledge and consent of the people. The age of shadow governments and backroom deals was over. This demand was broadcast from every corner of the earth. It was a single unified message translated into hundreds of languages, but carrying the same essential meaning. New leaders, chosen from the ranks of the people, teachers, doctors, scientists, and artists, stepped forward to articulate this vision. They used the same global communication network that had exposed the lie to build the framework for a new truth. They proposed a global council, not of nations competing for power, but of human representatives working for the common good of the planet and all its inhabitants. The focus shifted from national security to human security. The old leaders had no choice but to listen. Stripped of their armies and their control over information, their power was gone. One by one, they resigned. Some tried to flee, but there was nowhere to hide in a world so connected and united. The transition was remarkably peaceful. It was not a revolution of swords and fire, but a revolution of consciousness. The palaces and parliaments that were once symbols of distant, unaccountable power were opened up to the public. They became museums of a bygone era, reminders of a time when humanity had almost allowed fear to conquer hope. The new era began with a global pact, not a treaty between governments, but a promise between people. It was a pledge to resolve conflicts through dialogue and understanding, not violence. It was a commitment to cherish the planet's resources for the benefit of all, not the profit of a few. It was a vow to teach future generations the story of the Great Refusal, to ensure they would never forget that the ultimate power always rests with the people. The shared voice of humanity had not only stopped a war, it had demanded and created a new, more hopeful dawn for everyone. This story, though fictional, touches upon a deep and powerful truth. It reminds us that the world we live in is the world we choose to create. The structures of power, the narratives of conflict, and the inevitability of war are not laws of nature. They are human constructions, and because they are made by humans, they can be unmade by humans. We are not merely spectators in the grand drama of history, we are its authors. Every day, with our choices, with our actions, with our consent, we write the next page. We have the power to write a different story. In our real world today, we face our own challenges. We are told that conflict is unavoidable, that our differences are too great to overcome. We are fed fear and division through our screens. But the power to refuse this narrative lies within each of us. The choice to see the humanity in others, even those we are told to call our enemy, is a revolutionary act. The choice to seek understanding over judgment, to build bridges over walls, is how we begin to build a world without war. It starts not in the halls of power, but in our own hearts and minds. We must remember that unity is our greatest strength. When we stand together, people of all backgrounds, all nations and all beliefs, our collective voice is more powerful than any weapon. History has shown us this time and again. Great movements for change, from civil rights to the end of apartheid, were successful because ordinary people came together and peacefully demanded a better world. They refused to accept the injustice of their time as permanent. They chose to believe in the possibility of something better, and in doing so, they made it real. So let us carry this hopeful message forward. Let us believe in our shared capacity for peace and cooperation. War is not our destiny. It is a choice. And humanity can always make a different choice. We can say no to conflict. We can refuse to be pawns in the games of the powerful. We can choose to see each other not as strangers or enemies, but as fellow travelers on this small, beautiful planet. The future is not yet written. We hold the pen. Let us write a future of unity, a future of understanding, and a future of enduring peace.